Hey guys, welcome to BudgetEDH. I'm your host Mike, and on this week's episode we bring you Anowon, the Ruined Thief, out of Battle for Zendikar. If you're looking for singles, sealed product, or accessories, check out our affiliate link at tcgplayer.com. It doesn't cost you anything, but it does help out our channel quite a bit if you use our affiliate link, and we really appreciate it. Another way you can support us is directly on patreon.com/budgetedh. There you'll find different tiers that you can sign up for and different rewards that you'll get at each tier. We can't do this show without our patrons, and we really appreciate the support. This show is sponsored by Dragon Shield. If you're looking for sleeves, binders, playmats, or accessories, check out dragonshield.com. If you use our affiliate link, it'll help support the show. Dragon Shield's also giving back 25% to game stores off of every purchase that you make on their store right now. So check out dragonshield.com. Thank you. Anowon is 2, a blue and a black for legendary creature vampire rogue. Other rogues you control get +1/+1. Whenever one or more rogues you control deal combat damage to a player, that player mills a card for each 1 damage dealt to them. If the player mills at least 1 creature card this way, you draw a card. Anowon is a rogue tribal deck. He's a lord, so he's going to pump up all our rogues. So we're going to go for the maximum amount of rogues in our deck, and we're going to go for a mill sub-theme in here. It's not the main way that you're going to win the game with Anowon, but you can mill your opponents out and get a lot of value off of putting cards into the graveyard. We have a ton of card draw in here. Anowon has card draw stapled onto him as well. Whenever your rogues deal combat damage to a player and you mill a creature card, you can draw a card. So we do have a lot of card draw in here. We want to be drawing a lot of cards. We do have a lot of evasive threats. Rogues are very evasive in nature. We want to be able to get that damage in so we can take advantage of Anowon's ability to mill our opponents and then also get card draws off of that mill. And then we do have a couple of ways in this deck that we can pump up our rogues, which is great because they're all evasive, so they will get in for that combat damage. And that is the main way that we can win with this deck, is to pump our rogues up and win through combat damage. Let's quickly go through the stats on this deck. So we have 10 ramp cards, 16 card draw spells, which is quite a bit. And this does include Anowon as well, because he does have the ability of drawing cards whenever you mill your opponents out. We have 33 rogues in here, which this is a rogue tribal deck, so you do want around 30 rogues in this deck. We have 9 pieces of interaction in here, and then we do have 34 lands in this deck. Our average CMC in this deck is pretty low, so we don't need a huge land count in here. Just enough to hit our land drops is great. Next up, I want to go over the ramp that we have in this deck. Now, I did want to go with cheap mana rocks in this deck because Anowon only costs 4 mana, and we want to try to get him down on turn 3 if possible. So that really only allows us to play 1 or 2 mana cost mana rocks in this deck in order to take advantage of getting Anowon down early. So first up, we've got Wayfarer's Bauble, which is an absolute powerhouse. It has crept up in price quite a bit. Even with the list printing, it's still almost $3. Hopefully we get a reprint here in Commander Legends would be fantastic to drive the price down on this card. It will be a budget staple again. Then we've got Soul Ring, the best mana rock in the game, and then Prismatic Lens lets you tap for a colorless, or you can filter a mana with it. Then we've got all sorts of 2 mana rocks. We've got Mind Stone, which taps for a colorless. Demir Signet lets you filter a colorless into 2 different types of mana. And then Arcane Signet lets you add a mana of any color in your commander's color identity to your mana pool. Then we've got Felwar Stone and Talisman of Dominance. They both add a mana to your mana pool. And then Commander Sphere is our only 3 converted mana cost rock in this deck. Did want to have 10 ramp cards, and this is the last one that I could put in here. The nice thing about this is you can actually sacrifice this to draw a card if you're flooding out on mana, which is why I included it in this deck instead of some of the other 3 costed artifacts. So next up, let's go over some of the card draw that we have in this deck. Now, we do have quite a bit of card draw in here, and we have a lot stapled onto our creatures, and then our commander as well. So I'm just going to go through the ones that just fit into the card draw category, not the other ones. So we have Scheming Symmetry, which is basically a vampiric tutor in this deck, because when your opponent goes to put that card on top of your library and then you swing with Anowon, you're going to mill that card anyway, giving you a card but not your opponent. While this isn't really card draw, I did put it into this category because I didn't really have another spot to put it. Visions of Beyond is a 1 mana, draw 3 if your opponents have 20 or more cards in their graveyard, which most of the time they will with this deck. Thieves Fortune is a instant. You can play for its prowl cost if you dealt damage to a player with a rogue. And then you can look at the top 4 cards of your library, put 1 into your hand, the rest in the bottom of your library. Then we've got Windfall, where everyone discards their hand. You draw up to whoever had the most cards that they discard. Distant Melody is a great card in any tribal deck that has blue, because you can choose a creature type and then draw a card for each permanent you control of that type. Fact or Fiction is just one of my favorite card draw spells. It's an instant that lets you reveal the top 5 of your library. An opponent separates them into 2 piles and you pick one to put into your hand, and the other goes into your graveyard. Then we've got two really great cards in here. We've got Biden of Thassa, Reconnaissance Mission. They both have the text that whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, you can draw a card. And then they both have their own advantages. Reconnaissance Mission lets you cycle it, and Biden of Thassa gives creatures your opponents control attack this turn if able, which is really good because then you can get in with your rogues unblocked. Next up, let's go over some of the interaction that we have in this deck. So all of our interaction here is single targeted removal. So the first three cards are all ways of dealing with problematic creatures on the battlefield, and they all cost 1 or 2 mana. Having a low converted mana cost is really important because we do want to tap out and cast our creatures. So we do want the removal that is going to be the cheapest in our deck that's possible so that we can keep putting creatures onto the battlefield, but only leave up 1 or 2 mana in case we need to get rid of a problematic permanent. Then we've got a new one, Feed the Swarm. This is a great card in any black deck that can't deal with enchantments because it will let you deal with enchantments. Brand new out of Zendikar Rising, and you can destroy a creature or an enchantment that an opponent controls, and you lose life equal to that permanent's converted mana cost. Drown in the Lock and Counterspell are 2 mana counterspells that are absolutely great in this deck. Drown in the Lock also lets you destroy a creature as well. And then we've got Negate, Arcane Denial, and Countersquall. These are all different counterspells and only cost 2 converted mana cost that you can leave up that 2 mana to protect your turn in case somebody tries to go off and win the game. But you can also use a lot of your mana in your turn too to play out your rogues, which is exactly what you want to do to be able to put pressure onto your opponents. Next up, let's go over all the rogues that we have in this deck. Now, like I said earlier in the video when we were going through the deck breakdown, the name of our game here is to play evasive threats that can get in unblocked on our opponents, have flying, have unblockable, things like that. Now, a lot of these creatures are going to be very low casting cost creatures, which is perfect because we do want to get them onto the battlefield before we play Anowon, which is not only going to make them bigger, but also going to help us get some advantage when we attack with them. So first up, we've got 3 cards that are evasive that all cost 1 mana. We've got Vampire Cutthroat, Slitherblade, and Changeling Outcast. Not really a whole lot to say here other than they are evasive and they are going to help us take advantage of Anowon's ability. Then we've got 2 other creatures that are evasive at 1 mana cost. We've got Nightshade Stinger and Merfolk Windrobber. And then Thieves Guild Enforcer is a powerhouse in this deck. It's a 1 mana rogue that has flash. Whenever it or another rogue enters the battlefield under your control, each opponent mills 2 cards. And then it also has, as long as an opponent has 8 or more cards in their graveyard, it gets +2/+1 and has Death Touch, making it tough to attack into you when you have this card on the battlefield with some of your opponent's more powerful creatures. Then we've got 3 more evasive cards that cost 2 mana this time. We've got Ink Fathom Infiltrator, which actually recently just gone up in price. Looter Ilkor has Shadow, and then Invisible Stalker has Hexproof and can't be blocked. Then we've got Ghostly Pilferer, which is a newer one out of M21. It becomes untapped. You can pay 2 if you do draw a card. Whenever an opponent casts a spell from anywhere other than their hand, draw a card, and you can discard a card and it can't be blocked. Una's Blackguard is a 2 mana evasive threat. And then Thieving Skydiver is one of my favorite cards out of Zendikar Rising. It's got Kicker X, and you got to note here that X can't be 0. And then whenever it enters the battlefield, if it was kicked, gain control of target artifact with converted mana cost X or less. The really awesome thing about this, you can steal your opponent's soul rings, mana crypts, mana vaults, things like that for only 1 extra mana, making it a very, very powerful card, especially in a rogue deck, but really in any blue deck as well. Next up, we've got Soaring Thought Thief. It's a flash flying rogue. As long as the opponent has 8 or more cards in their graveyard, rogues you control get +1/+0. And whenever 1 or more rogues you control attack, each opponent mills 2 cards. Now, one thing to note with this is this will only trigger 1 time, even if you have 5 different creatures attacking. You only get that mill for 2 once. Disciple of Deceit is a card that has Inspired and it becomes untapped. You can discard a non-land card. If you do, search your library for a card with the same converted mana cost as that card and put it into your hand. Seg River Cutthroat comes into the pre-con deck. This is great because this card was quite expensive before, I think about $7 or $8. At the beginning of each end step, if an opponent lost 3 or more life this turn, you can draw a card. Then we've got Frog Tosser Banneret, which reduces the cost of Goblin and Rogue spells. Meringue River Prowler, which is an evasive creature at 3 mana cost. Nighthawk Scavenger costs 3 mana. It has Flying Death Touch and Lifelink, and its power is equal to 1 plus the number of card types among cards in your opponent's graveyards. This card can get out of control pretty quickly and can gain you a lot of life, which is really nice. Then we've got Adaptive Automaton, which is a creature that when it enters the battlefield, you can choose a creature type, and it is a lord for those creatures. Master Thief is great. When it enters the battlefield, gain control of target artifact for as long as you control it. And then Gonti, Lord of Luxury, lets you look at the top 4 cards cards of target opponent's library, exile one face down, and you can play it as long as it remains exiled, and you can spend mana as though it were mana of any type to cast it. Then we've got Wrinkle, Master of Pranks. It's a flying haste creature. Whenever it deals combat damage, you can choose any number of these. Each player discards a card, each player loses a life, and each player sacks a creature. Stink Drinker Bandit is one of the ways that we're able to pump up all of our creatures. It has whenever a rogue you control attacks and isn't blocked, it gets +2/+1 until end of turn. This does also have Prowl, letting you play it out cheaper earlier in the game. Notion Thief's an absolutely fantastic card and played a lot in EDH groups. It has flash, and if an opponent would draw a card except the first one they draw in each of their draw steps, instead that player skips that draw and you draw a card. If you play this with Windfall, you'll nuke all of your opponent's hands and you'll draw a ton of cards. Then we've got Keeper of Keys. It's a creature. When it enters the battlefield, you become the monarch. And at the beginning of your upkeep, if you're the monarch, creatures you control can't be blocked this turn, which is really great. Then we've got Earwig Squad. It's got Prowl. And when it enters the battlefield, if its Prowl cost was paid, search target opponent's library for 3 cards and exile them. Then that player shuffles his or her library. This is a great card for getting rid of some combo pieces that your opponents may have in their deck or any of their very powerful spells. Sereth Sands, another new rogue out of Zendikar Rising. It's got flash, and you can pay 2 blue and a black to return an unblocked attacking rogue you control to its owner's hand. Put it from your hand onto the battlefield tapped and attacking. And then the better part of this is that whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you may put target permanent card from that player's graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. Now it does say permanent, so I just want to say that again. This card is absolutely fantastic if you can get it to connect with one of your opponents. You can get whatever the best permanent is in their graveyard on the battlefield under your control. Then we've got Enigma Thief, which is also in the precon. It's a Prowl, and then whenever it enters the battlefield for each opponent, return up to 1 target non-land permanent that player controls to its owner's hand. And then we've also got Sepulchral Primordial. It's a creature that has Intimidate, and when it enters the battlefield for each opponent, you may put up to 1 target creature card from that player's graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. This is the only card that we have in this deck that allows us to put creature cards from our opponent's graveyards onto the battlefield under our control. There are a lot that come into the precon deck. I don't really think that's a strategy you really want to go for in this deck. I do think that you can kill your opponents quicker if you just swing out with rogues and either mill them out or deal enough combat damage to kill them. I don't think putting your opponent's creatures onto the battlefield is where you want to be. Next up, let's go over some of the utility cards that we have in this deck. So first up, we've got Icon of Ancestry. Enters the battlefield, choose a creature type. So in this deck, we will choose rogues, of course. Creatures you control the chosen type get +1/+1. And then you can look at the top 3 cards of your library and reveal a rogue and put it into your hand. Knowledge Exploitation is one that has recently gone up in price because of this precon deck. It is a sorcery that you can prowl in, and you can search a target opponent's library for an instant or sorcery card and then play it without playing its mana cost, which is fantastic. Notorious Strong comes in the precon. It's got Prowl, and you can create X 1/1 Black Fairy Rogue creature tokens with flying, where X is the damage dealt to your opponents this turn. If its Prowl cost was paid, you get to take an extra turn after this one. This card's really powerful. We see this in Edric decks all the time, and usually you'll see a bunch of ways of returning it back to your hand so that you can go infinite with this card, which we didn't really go that route in this deck. Then we've got Tetsuko Umezawa Fugitive. This allows all of your creatures with power or toughness 1 to be unblockable, which is very powerful because we do want to have our rogues get in for combat damage so that we can take advantage of Anowon's ability. Then we've got Ashiok Dreamrender. Spells and abilities your opponents control can't cause their controller to search their library, which is a very powerful ability on a Planeswalker. And then the even more powerful part with this is that target player puts the top 4 cards of their library into their graveyard, then exile each opponent's graveyard. And you can do this up to 5 times with Ashiok. So if your opponents are playing a Reanimator type strategy or something that focuses on the graveyard and you're playing a mill deck, that's obviously not very good. So we do want ways of getting rid of your opponent's graveyard, which I went with Ashiok because I think she's an absolute beast in this deck. And then probably one of the best cards in this entire deck is Sir Conrad the Grim. It's a legendary creature. Whenever another creature dies or a creature card is put into a graveyard from anywhere other than the battlefield, or a creature card leaves your graveyard, Sir Conrad the Grim deals 1 damage to each opponent, and then you can pay 1 in a black. Each player mills a card. As you're milling out your opponents with Anowon, this card is going to help you deal some damage to all of your opponents as well. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch our video today. If you haven't already, subscribe to our YouTube channel and check us out on social media on Facebook, Twitter, or Reddit. We'll see you next time.